to the next event within our conference. And this event is actually very complementary to what we had right now. We discussed the different issues of international trade, of global value chains, how they were affected by the recent developments, by the pandemic, by US-China trade war, and other issues and crises of different type. So now we have the keynote speech of Professor Rичард Болдуин. It is an honor for us to have you, Richard, here. I will start with very quick introduction of Professor Baldwin, and then we'll give the floor to him. Rичард Болдуин is a professor of international economics at the Graduate Institute in Geneva since 1991. He is also the editor-in-chief of Vox platform, and he was the founder of this platform in 2007. He was also the president director of Center of Economic Policy Research, a visiting professor at Oxford and MIT. Professor Baldwin did his PhD in economics at MIT with Paul Krugman, whom I'm sure everybody here knows, including the students that are presented here. And also Richard had a number of co-authored articles with Paul Krugman. Professor Baldwin is a specialist in international trade, globalization, regionalism, and the European integration. He published the very interesting book, The Great Convergence, in 2016, which was called by many analytics and by Lawrence Summers, for example, as one of the most important books on globalization ever. And as for me, I actually teach the economic globalization based partly on this book. That's why it is an honor for me personally to have Professor Baldwin here. But actually not to take too much time for my moderation and some introductory issues. So I am giving the floor to Professor Baldwin. Please, Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. How long should I plan to talk to? How much should I leave for Q&A? 10 minutes, 5 minutes?
I think that's 30 minutes for talk and about 25 minutes for Q&A. It is
okay. Perfect. Thanks. Well, first of all, let me thank the organizers for letting me share my ideas with this audience. Really disappointed I can't be in Moscow there with you. Things are complicated here, but I haven't been to Moscow in several years, and it's a great town. So sorry I can't be there with you and enjoying a dinner tonight, but this is COVID, so we'll do the best we can, right? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I have to get this sharing screen up. I will share my screen. Here it is. Share. And I will go to full screen. Oops, we're halfway through. Sorry about that. Okay, let's. So the sort of title of this is COVID, Climate Change and the Future of Trade. And at least part of it is going to be based on the Great Convergence book that Igor was so kindly mentioned. Well, what I want to do is start by changing the way you think about globalization. And I think most of us, and certainly most of the media, has a very clear mindset as to what globalization is and what trade is and how it works. And I fundamentally believe that leads to some misunderstandings of what happened in the last 25 years, and above all, what's likely to happen going forward. So what I'd like to start with is just a little framework which characterizes globalization in a different way. This is what was developed in this book, although I actually developed it back in 2006. So what I wanted to start with is some stylized facts to convince you that globalization has changed radically in history, at least twice. So you shouldn't be surprised if it changes radically going forward, as I think it will be. And I want to provide a sort of intellectual framework, a model, if you will, of how and why it changed. So in this graph, you see the share of world GDP on the vertical axis and the years going from the year 1000 up to about 2014 on the horizontal axis. And I follow two groups of countries, China and India on one hand, and the G7 on the other hand, the industrialized countries. As you see, go back to the year 1000, China and India had about half the world's GDP. And that was because they had about half the world's population. And back in the year 1000, there was no industrial revolution. So countries' incomes were not that different. The G7 was a very small part of the population, and therefore it had a very small share. And for 18 centuries, and in fact, even going back further, nothing changed. The share of India and China was essentially stable, and the G7s rose slightly because the incomes rose a bit, going up to 1820 or so, but a lot of it was population growth, especially in the US and Canada. And then, as you can see, from 1820, something radical changed. And that radical was globalization. Industrialization was well underway, but globalization opened up the world market. And the G7 went from about 1/5 of world income up to about 2/3. And correspondingly, China and India's plummeted down to about 10%. And then something changed. As you can see, around 1990, the G7 share of world GDP started plummeting, and now it's back to where it was in the year of 1900. And India's and China and a whole bunch of other emerging markets started rising. So these two, the purple and the green lines coming together, that's the great convergence. Now, what I want to do is explain why it changed. I want to give you my theory, my conceptualization of why it changed. And I'll use it. This isn't just a history lesson. I'm going to use it, the same framework, to predict what's going to happen to future trade. To do this, I'm not going to lay out equations and all sorts of things. I'm going to simplify to clarify. Here it is. Arbitrage drives globalization. Whenever the relative price of things are different in two different countries, there's an incentive for firms to arbitrage on those differences, and that arbitrage goes two ways. Now, what I'd like to focus on is the fact that the arbitrage isn't just in goods, which is the traditional mainstream way of thinking about globalization. It's in goods, know-how, and labor services. The arbitrage is constrained by three very different types of costs. Trade costs, which constrain goods, communication costs, which constrain know-how arbitrage, and face-to-face costs, which constrain labor services. And I'd like to associate each of those with past, present, and future globalization. So the globalization of 1820 to 1900 was really all about making it easier for arbitrage and trade in goods. From about 1990, the information and communication technology allowed arbitrage in know-how in ways which I'll talk about. And going forward, I think digital technology will bring down the barriers to trade in labor services, cross-border trade and labor services, and thereby fundamentally change the nature of future trade. Okay, now to convince you that this little framework, this little model, I hesitate to even call it a model, what I want to do is use it to organize a very quick discussion of the last 170 years of globalization. And I'm going to assert, following a fairly common thing in economic history, that real globalization got going in 1820, in the sense that this is the first time when prices within countries were determined by international supply and demand, not domestic supply and demand. It was done by O'Rourke and Williamson, looking at the correlation of wheat prices across the Atlantic. So steam revolution and Pax Britannica lower the cost of moving goods, but didn't lower the cost of ideas moving or face-to-face by very much. The low trade costs made high volume trade feasible. Comparative advantage made it profitable. And so we went from a situation in the left there where production and consumption were bundled spatially to a situation in the right where production and consumption were spatially separated, potentially over long distances. And production concentration led to a rise in trade, because trade is just what happens when stuff is made one place and consumed another. So that is what led to the rise of trade, and looking at the trade flows is what mainstream trade theory is about. It's what Ricardo was all about, explaining who exported what. But fundamentally, it was an arbitrage on the relative price of goods. But that wasn't the end of the story. As markets expanded globally, production clustered locally to reduce communication costs, not trade cost. So here on the left, you have dispersed production. Think about it as a blacksmith producing nails and horseshoes for a dozen families, one in each village. You had very small production scales because there was a very small market for them. When the world market opened up, it proved advantageous to move to more scale-intensive processes. And in order to coordinate those very complex scale-intensive processes, the production processes were clustered into factories, micro-clustered. Now, these clusters did not appear because of trade costs. They appeared because of face-to-face and communication costs. But that wasn't the end of the story, because the micro-clustering fostered innovation and thereby ignited a bonfire of innovation and modern growth. So here on the left, you had each blacksmith maybe thinking a few good ideas, but they didn't really start a bonfire of innovation, partly because you didn't have other blacksmiths to talk about, too, and partly, who cares if you're only making nails for a dozen families? But once we got this great big world market and a lot of clustered activities, both the supply of ideas and the demand for new ideas started going, making the market larger, increasing the demand, so the bonfire of modern growth got started. Now that got started first and fastest in what we now call the industrialized world. And that created the Great Divergence, because the micro-clustering triggered growth that for 170 years was faster in the rich countries than the poor countries. Many of you aren't old enough to remember when the rich countries grew faster than the poor countries. The last 25, 30 years, it's always been emerging markets growing faster than rich countries, but that wasn't the way when I was growing up, and that's how that Great Divergence happened. Now, the new globalization begins around 1990. The revolution in information communication technology lowered the cost of moving ideas, so now we have a lower cost of moving goods and a lower cost of moving ideas, but we still have high face-to-face costs. The lower communication costs made offshoring feasible, and wage differences made it profitable. So on the left here, we have this micro-clustered, and some of these stages of production really don't belong where they were. So for example, if the factory was making Fords in Detroit using very unskilled labor-intensive processes, it didn't really belong in Detroit. But before the ICT revolution, it was impossible to separate the production and put something down in Mexico and hope it worked together. But the ICT allowed the separation to coordinate the whole thing. And that's what everybody's noticed: offshoring, outsourcing, fragmentation, deindustrialization of the rich countries, rapid industrialization of a few emerging markets. But that wasn't really the main thing that changed. The main thing that changed was that to ensure offshore production meshed seamlessly, G7 firms offshored the know-how with the jobs. So the nature of globalization changed because know-how was crossing borders, in particular in manufacturing, to a handful of countries, and it was the firm's know-how which was moving. It's not national know-how, it's firm-level know-how. Now, the point here is that these bonfire of international growth and innovation, which used to happen inside factories, inside the G7, was now happening across borders. And that allowed a very rapid industrialization of a handful of developing countries. And that then led to rising incomes, which triggered a commodity investment boom, super cycle, which brought along a whole bunch of other countries. So that's what is the great convergence driven by knowledge flows. And to kind of bring home how different this trade is, why it changed and why it had different effects, I want to use this little infographic. The punchline is that offshoring is a new pipeline for knowledge arbitrage. So think about the world as two types of economies: headquarter economies and factory economies. And in the headquarter economies, it has a high know-how to labor ratio and therefore high wages. In the factory economy, they have a low know-how to labor ratio and therefore low wages. And what the offshoring and global value chains did was allow the know-how from the G7 to be applied directly to the workers in the factory economies. And that completely changed the nature of global manufacturing competition. It created the high-tech, low-wage combination that revolutionized the world of manufacturing, and the rise of China being the most spectacular example of that. Now, of course, China is now generating its own technology. It's on a dynamo itself, but this is the way it started. So the result was the Great Convergence. Okay, so that's history. And I hope I can convince you that because the arbitrage was on only goods to start with, and then goods and know-how second, the nature of globalization changed. Now I want to talk about future globalization. I put up this slide, the future is unknowable, but also inevitable, to remind you that when we talk about the future, we do not know what we're talking about. We're just making it up. So don't listen to what I predict. Listen to the logic I use to make those predictions, because we will all individually have to try and figure out what's happening in the future. Because whatever we do, it is inevitable. And the worst possible way to think about the future is to pretend it's going to keep staying on like it is now, or the past will be just like the future. Okay, this brings me to my more recent book in 2019 called the Globotics Upheaval, where I believe digital technology is launching a new type of globalization, what I would call the third unbundling, where we're going to start to get more arbitrage in labor services. So the idea here, and it's just with this little infographic, I'll give you that basic idea now and talk it through a little bit more. The digital technology is launching both automation and globalization of white collar and professional jobs. Now that's really different, because all the globalization we've been talking about and the automation up to now has been primarily in manufacturing. And the impact of globalization and automation has been felt by blue collar workers. And we all know the whole skills bias and all that sort of stuff. But now I believe that globalization and automation are going to come to the service sector. And I think it's going to happen faster than most people think and in ways few expect. So I definitely want to leave a lot of time for questions. So I may be skipping a few slides, but let's get started here on the definitions. So what do I mean by globotics? Globotics is a kind of ugly, but hopefully memorable word that smashes together globalization with robotics. But here, I want you to think about globalization not as a picture of a ship with containers on it moving goods from China to the West Coast of the United States. That's not what I want you to think about globalization. I want you to think about it as telemigration, which is people working from home when home is abroad. I think international commuting will become a major source of service trade, which will start to dominate trade. I mean, it's already going on, but I think that will be the wave of the future. And when I talk about robotics here, I'm not talking about industrial robots, which is what most of us see, in our news feeds and study in our in econometrics, because that's where the data is. I'm talking about software automation or white collar robots that are taking over certain service tasks. Basically, there's a variety of types of software. And I'd like to contrast this one as remote intelligence, which is telemigration, and artificial intelligence, which is what is driving the white collar robots. So telemigration is just people sitting abroad in one nation and working in offices in another. This goes on and it's growing, but I predict it'll be much bigger. White collar robots, there's two types of them. One is a sort of low end, which is replacing relatively routine information processing jobs. And one of the major ones there is called robotic process automation. And if you haven't read about robotic process automation, I'll let you read on your own, because it's very important and it's changing the world of offices in many rich countries. There's also a high-end version of white collar robots. This one's called Amelia, but there's Watson, and many banks have them, many large corporations have them. They're essentially sophisticated AI platforms that can do many things. and they're replacing high-level jobs like lawyers, young lawyers, or partly replacing architects, or taking over certain aspects of medical services and things like that. So now I want to turn to a couple of points of why I really like to stress that this time is different. This isn't just the ICT revolution of 1990, but continued. I think it's fundamentally different and will lead to fundamentally different outcomes. And I want to spend the next few minutes trying to convince you of that. So the first thing, the most obvious I've mentioned, is this is affecting service and professional jobs, not just factory jobs. The people in this top photo, most of them know nothing about globalization or automation. The people in the bottom there, they know all about competing with China abroad and robots at home. The people on the top are not ready for it. So it will be a very disruptive thing for them. The second is the changes that came with COVID. So I just want to, there's obviously many, many of them, but I want to focus on three. First of all, COVID-19 forced an emergency digital transformation, which will have lasting and massive effects on the way service sectors work. So it wasn't so much a change in the technology as everybody went to the technology frontier at the same time and is now there. Everybody knows how to use Zoom. Companies have learned how to arrange remote work teams. Customers have learned how to receive service products remotely. All these things were changed because of COVID, and they're not going away. Now, the second point is that the domestic remote teams opens the door to service offshoring. So once we've all gotten used to working from home with remote teams, our companies will be tempted to move some of those tasks even further away for much less price. So just to remind you, in $5 an hour in most parts of the world is a middle-class living. If you take $5 an hour, work 2,000 hours a year, is $10,000. And in many countries in the world, most countries in the world, that's a middle-class living. So the wage arbitrage that this opens up to is enormous. And the wage differences are the largest arbitrage opportunity left in the world because all the ones have been arbitraged away. And third, social spacing raises the value of adopting white-collar robots and telemigrants. This may not last forever, but it's definitely going there. Okay, the next one, I want to argue that today's AI is different. So in 2021, computers can read, write, see, speak, understand speech, create visual output, recognize subtle patterns. And in 2015, they couldn't. So what changed? I argue that it's the programming that's different. So you will remember this book, Thinking Slow, Thinking Fast, which recognizes that humans have two very different cognitive processes. One, which is conscious, things like doing algebra. You know what you're doing. And since you know what you're doing, you could write a computer program, a code, to teach a computer to do that. Other things we do, like catching our balance when running over uneven ground, we do not know how we do it, so we could never write a computer program to teach a robot to do it. But now we're writing programs using machine learning, which is a radical different way. It's essentially estimating large statistical models without having to put down the logic. And so computers now have a whole set of cognitive capacities that they did not have before 2015 or 2016. Things like natural language processing or translation, all sorts of features that are now quite common were impossible to do, and it's because we changed the way we program computers. Some of those new cognitive capacities are useful in the workplace and are replacing workers. So another key aspect is Globotics is advancing at this explosive pace of digital technology. And since it involves information, the physical constraints are much less. So before, to say double the flow of imports and exports, you had to build ports and ships and factories, and that took time. What we're talking about here is moving information across borders that already exists. So it's much easier to double the flows of information and services than it is to double the flows of goods. So I'm going to skip this part. It's kind of fun, but I'll skip this. So the other thing I want to argue about the future of globalization is coming in ways that few of us expect. So first of all, think tasks, not occupations. So many jobs will go, and these Globots will transform pretty much every service sector job, but it won't eliminate whole occupations. So what you should be thinking about is what aspects of my job might be automated by some software or offshored to somewhere which is much cheaper wages. Not my entire job. Us professors, for example, there's lots of stuff we could do, like grading papers or conducting office hours to help students with things. Those could be offshored, outsourced, and other things could be automated. The second is that it won't look like factory closures. So in the past, globalization, since it's affected manufacturing, tended to be quite sudden and very obvious. So the whole factory would shut down and people would be thrown out of work. That's not the way it's going to happen. It's going to be like little changes, one by one, that accumulate into big changes. And this is how I'd like you to think about it, the iPhone infiltration. I'd like to create a parallel between how the iPhone, let's just say smartphones came into our lives and completely changed the way our societies work, our work relationships, our relationships with our families, our relationships with the environment, with the maps, with the media, with our social networks. These smartphones have transformed the way we live, but nobody decided to let that happen. It happened in a very subtle, at first unperceived way, because it was millions or billions of seemingly unconnected small changes that accumulated into a massive change in the way we live. And I think Globots, software automation and offshoring, will come into our work lives in that same way. It'll be imperceptible, but eventually in 10 years' time, we'll go, how did we ever work like that in the old days? Okay, so I'm going to skip this part, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about the things that I think are going to go ahead with services. Then I'll talk about some statistics, and then I'll just end so we have plenty of time for questions. Okay, so what I want to do is talk about what's driving telecommunications. So the big driving force is what I mentioned, is wage differences. So this summer, or actually last winter, I did a study on Colombia, the telecommuting in telemigration in Colombia, the possibilities of it. And so we took the jobs in the United States that were classified as work from homeable by Dingle and Neumann, and we lined it up with the help of a couple of labor economists from Colombia with the job classifications in Colombia. And then we compared the wages in the occupations that were teleworkable. And we found that the average difference was 15 times, 1,500% difference in the wage. Now that's an enormous incentive to arbitrage. But the thing that's stopping it is not tariffs, it's not quotas, it's not even regulation, it's mostly technological barriers. So these four things I think are going to enable it. The domestic telecommuting, as I talked before, these online freelancing platforms, which are like eBay or Alibaba, but for services, advanced telecoms, which is making remote people even less remote, and machine translation, which is breaking down language barriers at a very rapid pace. The next point is that a lot of this trade in services will take place in intermediate services. Now, all of you have been familiar with final goods and intermediate goods, and those of you who have specialized in trade know that most of the world's trade is in intermediate goods, not final goods. And I'm suggesting that digital technology will allow massive trade in intermediate service goods, thereby creating service value chains that are unbundled and spread across. So let me just give you an example here of a human resource recruiter's value chain. This is a sequence of tasks. Conduct needs analysis. I won't read through all these things. But in the old days, all these things would be done in the same office, maybe by one or two different people. But what digital technology has allowed is a fragmentation of this chain, and certain parts of it will either be automated or outsourced. And so that has opened up the value chain. That has removed most of the barriers because almost all the regulation on services are the last mile between the service provider and the service buyer in a particular country. But all the intermediate services that are used to produce the service before it gets to the final provider, those are completely unregulated. Accounting services, HR, record keeping, analysis, all those things are almost completely unregulated, and therefore it's only technology that's holding them up. So this digital technology and the forced march means that remote workers are much less remote, and that's accelerating that trend. Okay, just a couple of statistics. Service growth is faster than goods growth. And in some sectors, it's 5 or 6 times faster, or 2 or 3 times faster. So telemigration services, the trade statistics in services is terrible. So this is total services, trade and goods. And you can see, if you look at total goods and total services, it's 4.2% globally versus 3.9%. So services are growing faster. So when I'm saying services are the wave of the future, I'm not making it up. This is just the way it's already going. But if you look at things that look more like telemigration, like telecoms and IT services, business services, what you see is that they're growing 2 to 3 times faster than trade. So this is actually inevitable. If you think about the fact that barriers to trade and services are far higher than they are in goods now. When people estimate the tariff equivalent of service barriers, they often come up with numbers that are in the thousands of percentage and certainly in the hundreds of percentages. But those barriers are being brought down by digital technology in a way that they're more or less half every 2 or 3 years. And if you have those barriers for a while and they start much higher, but the trade and goods barriers are not coming down, it's quite clear that trade and services is going to become the dominant thing of the future. And also remember, services is what most people do nowadays. 60 to 90% of most economies are in services, so there's plenty of people to buy and sell. Okay, I'm going to skip the thing on climate and trade for a second and just stop there and hopefully have a bit of time for questions now. So if it's already Agora, I'll just stop sharing and let's go to questions and answer, which are always more fun anyway. So.
Thank you so much, Professor Baldwin, for this presentation of your concept of globalization with a view of forward as well as the overview of the past. So now we have time for questions. Dear colleagues, please feel free to ask questions. I see the question from the request for question from Professor Brennan. Please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the very interesting and stimulating presentation. What I wanted to raise with you in terms of the scenario that you're describing, do you see or foresee, the trend towards enforcement of data localization, the rise of the splinter net, and so on, impacting at all the scenario that you're describing? Because much of what you're describing, of course, relies on free flows of data. It's very data intensive, it's knowledge intensive, with moves a step in terms of enforcing data localization and so on. Is that something that might in some way affect what you're laying out for as the future scenario?
Yes. So the answer is yes, but I don't think it's going to slow it down entirely. So what I have in mind is when let's say a consultant has processed some data and comes up with a PowerPoint, and then while they go to sleep, they send it off to, who knows, Poland, to have somebody fix it up with the colors and the fonts, and then in the morning it comes back. Now, in principle, you could imagine some rules which would prevent that. But in practice, it won't even be measured. So it's very hard to stop that kind of arbitrage. A lot of the data localization things that you're talking about are about large databases, and that will I believe we are going towards data localization more systematically. People worry about privacy and enforceability and all those sorts of things. But a lot of the stuff I have in mind with telemigration isn't really about storing large amounts of data. It's about doing a bit of work here for somebody who needs some work done and then shipping them off by email or website or something like that. But I think you've put your finger on an aspect of that, which is privacy. So I think if there is an upheaval against this, and that's the second word in my book's title is Globotics Upheaval, they'll look for ways to slow it down. And I think probably the way that they'll try to do it is by enforcing regulations on health, safety standards, but above all, privacy. So if they classified this information in the PowerPoint going back and forth as a privacy issue, they could shut it down potentially with criminal charges or whatever like that. And it's most definitely true that it will slow it down in things like medical services, where they won't want patient data to cross borders or make it. But so much of what goes on inside an office today is really not very sensitive information. It's not really even personal information. It's just people working together to get a document or a project done together. And so I think a lot of that will be difficult to stop. And it won't be stopped by the fact that data is localized, because it's just really not that much more different than email. So thank you for that question. I do think people will struggle and get very clever about ways to stop this. If I could tell you one anecdote where they've actually done it, but by mistake. So here in Switzerland, we have very important data bank privacy rules, and I'll let you guess why those rules got put in there, but they're in there. Now, what those rules mean is that it's a criminal offense to let client data cross the border. The first time it happens, there's a 100,000 franc fine for the first time. After that, people start going to jail. So as a consequence, none of the back office processes of Swiss banks have been offshored. So all the things, almost everybody's put it, their accounts department, their payroll department in India, or their IT. In Switzerland, it's all done in Switzerland because of potential criminal charges if the client data crosses the border. So that kind of draconian rules could in principle stop it, but before we get there, I don't think it will. And if I can tell one more story, I'm full of stories tonight. I think there's an interesting dichotomy between the splinter net you were talking about and the real economy. So as many of you will know, it's difficult to access PayPal. I'm sorry, it's difficult to access eBay in China. But if somehow or another you got through and you made an order on eBay, there would be no problem for the good itself being shipped from America to China. So this fragmentation affects things in ways that aren't really classically viewed. We shouldn't classically view as like there's a high tariff, so the less of it happens. It's a very different kind of fragmentation and easy to get away around in some sense. So thank you very much for the question.
Thanks. We have 3 questions. If you don't mind, I propose to collect them together, and then we will answer all the 3. First, Arne Melchior.
Okay, so thank you for a very nice presentation. I have a very naive question about the distinction between goods and services, how useful it is, because all goods include a lot of services, not only the labor services for the physical production, but if you buy a mobile phone, it has a whole range of services all along the way. And the services providers also use goods. They need computers and chairs and whatever. So yeah, so that what does it mean, the distinction at the end?
Thank you.
Thanks, and Alexander Zaitsev.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I have a question about telemigration. So what do you think, what effects we may expect from telemigration? So telemigration, is it an opportunity or a threat for economic development for poorer countries, for emerging market countries and middle income countries? Because these economies have a very good human capital, yes, and for example, Russia, we have an outflow of human capital, and it seems to me that this new opportunity, telemigration, can expand this outflow of human capital, and in this case, yes, these countries may suffer in terms of economic development, in terms of technological development. So what do you think about the potential effects of this trend?
Thank you.
Thank you. And Marek Dąbrowski.
Thank you. My question is about the role of language barrier. I understand that there is quality of computer translation improve a lot, but still there are some limits of this. And to which extent the perspective which you offer us is it still will be opportunity for those who speak and read language, English language. So perhaps this type of globalization will be more limited than classical offshoring of production of goods. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let me try and tackle these three excellent questions. I will take them actually in reverse order. So about machine translation. So I think what we can say is that having poor English will no longer be a big advantage. But if we start dealing with each other with more remote teams, it will become very important to have people who are really good at communicating. So what I see is a kind of hollowing out of it's already happened in translation, for example, translation services. The bottom end is completely gone because it's all done by machines. And even now, like if I want something translated, the people I'm paying, they will frequently, I guess they translate it at first with Google Translate or whatever, and then they go through and change a few things. So but if you're trying to negotiate a multi-million-dollar deal between people, you need somebody who understands context, culture, really masters the languages and subtleties. And if we start dealing with each other as service, I think it will create more jobs at the high end of that, but remove basically all the low end. So some table stakes level of English surely is going to be important, but that's a lot of the younger generation has, at least enough to listen to pop songs and stuff like that. But it is astounding how I was in China having traveled for a couple of years, it's so terrible. But in 2019, when we could travel, I was in China and I got around in China just holding up my phone like this. It's a simultaneous translation. I would say something in English and then it would translate it into Mandarin. People would understand, talk back to my phone and I would hear them. And this was 2 years ago. So it was not perfect. But I think that's another aspect of it is that many parts of language usage are simple and relatively codified, and those can be handled by machine translation. But lots of it won't. So in some ways, it's saying what will be and what will not be subject to telemigration will have divisions down it that we're not traditionally used to thinking about. It's not like, is it high transportation cost or subject to regulation? It could be like, how important is cultural sensitivity in this particular service or this particular task? And if it is, then it won't be offshore. If it isn't, then it will be offshore. And language is clearly one of these things where in some jobs, it's super important to have really subtle understanding. In other jobs, they're just telling people, put it there, put it there. So thank you for that question. So the answer, that took a long time to say, it depends. Good point, it depends. That's probably what I should have just said and then been quiet. The second question is it an opportunity or a threat for emerging markets? Now, the book I wrote, the Globotics Upheaval, was all about the threat it poses to rich countries. And I'm basically talking about the US and EU there in that particular case. But later on, I wrote a paper for Wider called Globotics and Development, where I traced out what this means. And exactly as you've intuited, this is an export opportunity. Because after all, we're talking about arbitrage. And if you look at emerging markets, a lot of extremely talented people are underpriced by world standards, incredibly underpriced. And that will then be an export opportunity for them. So in that paper, which I did with Rikard Forsli, I predict that this will allow the emerging market miracle to continue and spread geographically. Because up till now, the emerging market miracle has been based either like on the China model on rapid industrialization, but there's only maybe 6 emerging markets which really did it on manufacturing, or on commodities, which is brought along a whole bunch of other countries, but lots and lots of countries are left off. And in particular, I think that time zones will matter. So I think South and Central Latin America will provide a lot of services for North America, and Africa will provide lots of services for Europe. Southeast Asia will provide for Northeast Asia, and the whole former Soviet bloc is filled with highly educated people who are underpaid by world standards. So I suspect, at least in the Soviet bloc, there will be a lot of exports. And mind you, you know better than me, that's already happening in certain services. I'm just saying it's going to spread. And the exact same things that led to coding and web development and all the things that are done in former Soviet bloc countries, which are high education, low wage, those forces will spread to all sorts of other things. That's what I'm predicting. So I think it's a real opportunity for emerging. It's going to be upheaval in the rich countries. It's going to be an opportunity for the other countries. So if I can just say one or two little more things about that. So first of all, remember, globalization is driven by arbitrage. And what we're talking about now is arbitrage on wages. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be more exports from, say, Switzerland, which is super high wages. I mean, people who work McDonald's here earn $25 an hour. So we're super high wage, but the competition isn't always won by the cheapest. And the fact that Swiss people have a certain kind of regularity, dependability, consistency, I'm quite sure that they'll start exporting more services because of this, because some people want that Swiss quality and are willing to pay for it. So it won't just be one way. The second thing is that there's nothing new here. When I talked about the second unbundling, or when knowledge started moving, the nature of globalization really changed because it was factories crossing borders, not just goods. And we had to change our entire mindset of a world where the sources of comparative advantage moved across borders, not just the fruit of comparative advantage. And that's why it changed it. But what's going on now is simple arbitrage, which will look very much like the first one, in the sense services are underpriced, let's say in Colombia, compared to the United States. And as the barriers to that come, there will be an arbitrage, which will be an export opportunity and an income rise in Colombia. It will cause displacement in the U.S., just as the low-skilled manufactured goods from China did in the U.S., but this time in the service sector. So I think really, if you just take the standard trade model and realize that there's these price differences, you can predict what's going to happen. And it's to me, for emerging markets, it's going to be a good story. All right, and then Arnie asked the fundamental hard question: what's the difference between a good and a service? Now, so let me rush to say that it's a convenient separation, and it doesn't exist in the world, as you pointed out. So in trade, we tend to, the WTO anyways, distinguishes between 4 types of trade and services. So the first one is mode, where you're sitting in one country, the service providers in one country, the service buyers in another. The second one is where the buyer goes to the other country. That's like tourism. And the third one is where, say, the foreign bank puts into the customer's local presence in the customer's market. And the fourth one is people moving across temporarily. But increasingly, people talk about the fifth mode, which is services embedded in goods, especially when the service is continuous. So like if you buy a Tesla now, you every day get a service. They're updating the car in the service all the time. The same thing, if you bought a smartphone, the company is selling you software on a continuous basis on the base of a good. So there is quite a connection between the two of them. But the reason I like to separate them is because of the enormous price differences. Inside goods, the price differences are relatively limited or modest. In service wages, they're absolutely fantastically large, and therefore will lead to big arbitrage opportunities as the barriers come down. So I don't know if I answered your question, Arnie, but at least I talked for a little while.
Thank you so much. We have a question from Alexei Partansky, and then I myself will ask one more question. So let's collect a pair.
Good evening, Professor.
Good evening.
Professor, it is a pleasure to talk with you and to have a chance to ask you a question. You didn't talk about decoupling, but decoupling is a great danger for globalization now and tomorrow, I think. So, and decoupling is also, I hope, in our agenda. That is why my little questions about this. Decoupling is certainly not in the interests of the United States business community. As the US Chamber of Commerce recently reported, American companies would lose hundreds of billions of dollars if they slashed investment in China or the nation increased tariffs. Also, this may partly explain why even Trump administration, particularly Vice President Mike Pence, in 2019 answered with a resounding no when asked if the administration wanted to decouple from China. More recently, US Trade Representative Catherine Tai argued that far from decoupling, which isn't a realistic outcome, the United States is pursuing recoupling. US officials are merely pinpointing their goals in this process. So what do you think in the near future we will see decoupling or recoupling? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Then we have one question in chat. Could you please elaborate a bit on the climate change issue, or at least on the climate trade nexus? And the question from me, and after that, please answer all the three questions, if you may. The question on me is about the impacts of Globotics on the inequality in developed countries, because nowadays many blue collars in developed countries consider globalization as a threat because it makes downward pressure on their wages and so on. But in the future, so the part of white collars should also consider globalization as a threat. So what would be the impacts on that from the perspective of inequality, social polarization, and so all the issues like that? Thank you so much.
Thank you for those three really excellent questions. So let me start on the decoupling and admit immediately that geostrategic issues are above my pay grade. I'm a trade economist, so I don't really have deep insights to it. But I want to make a few points on it about the decoupling, not decoupling, and perhaps to sort of put into context your observations, which are entirely true, is that a lot of this is talk that isn't going to happen. So one thing that's not very well understood is how important China is into the manufacturing sectors of everybody around the world. In some sense, China has become the OPEC of industrial inputs. Everybody knows about the Chinese final goods, but the vast majority of their exports are in intermediate goods that go into inputs to other production. So I wrote a paper with a co-author, Rebecca Friedman, on global supply chains. Are they too risky? And there we looked at some indicators of the true dependence. We just took the example of the US auto industry on Chinese inputs. Now, if you measure it directly, it's something like 10%. If you look at the inputs that the American industry buys from China, it's about 10%. But the Canadian goods they buy also include Chinese goods. And the Canadian goods include German goods, which also include Chinese goods. And if you use these input-output tables to mash that all up, it's like 25% of the gross value of the output of the auto industry depends upon gross output in China. So to uncouple these will be incredibly expensive and disruptive. And that's why I don't think it's going to happen too much. But, you know, there was a Smoot-Hawley Act. The US has occasionally gone crazy and done very bad things on protectionism, and it creates a dynamo that you can see a little bit in the US political system where everybody is against the foreigners, and anybody who even says anything about liberalizing trade is some sort of traitor or something. I mean, you could see that happening, but I don't see it under the Biden administration. And funny enough, under Trump, it was mostly talk, and there was, you know, a lot of tariffs put on, but it didn't fundamentally disrupt that much. So I'm relatively optimistic that the realities of the importance of Chinese manufacturing in the world will keep cooperation going. Some things like semiconductors, medical supplies, that's going to happen. People are going to pay to repatriate, but on many of these things, I don't think they will. So that's the first one. The second thing is on climate change, and let me just give my. It's more like an attitude rather than a outcome. So when I'm here in Geneva and I'm a trade economist, and environment and climate change is all what everybody's talking about. Everybody wants to talk about. And when you're a trade economist, you sort of have to be slightly embarrassed because you're like, you know, we kind of need trade, but it's bad for the environment. And in many environments, trade is considered one of the evils that's leading to this. And what I want to do is reclassify that focal point to make it clear that there will be no climate rescue without trade. So if we look at the mitigation side, mitigation will require technology to go from a handful of countries and a few hundred companies to the whole world. And most of that technology is embedded in goods, services, intellectual property, or investment. And unless those flows continue, mitigation will not happen. Let's say, you know, energy efficient heating, or good isolation, or technology to scrub carbon out of coal plants. Those things will require trade flows, and the countries who are receiving the technology will have to export something to pay for it. So if trade system doesn't function well, mitigation will not happen. And then let's go to adaptation. Adaptation is basically a problem of water, heat, waves, and all of those solutions require technology, which again is embedded in goods, services, or investment. Take, for example, there will be an enormous problem of growing food in parts of Africa because of changing rain patterns and heat. And if people aren't going to starve or migrate, they will need heat-resistant seeds. They will need precision irrigation systems. That kind of technology will not cross borders unless the trade system is functioning well. So what I would like to turn this around, that there's a baby in the bathwater of trade. It's true, trade is involved in the whole market capitalist system, which does create emissions, but you can't fix the problem by shutting down trade. I like an analogy of agriculture. Those of you who have studied emissions know that agriculture accounts between 25 and 35% of all the emissions. But nobody says we have to end those emissions by ending agriculture. We realize that agriculture is essential, and what we talk about is changing it and encouraging it to do things in different ways. So that's my whole thing on trade, is that we have to work for the trading system and realize make it very clear to the public and the media that trade is essential to this whole thing. And people focusing on the emissions of air cargo and sea cargo transportation, yes, of course, we should improve those things. But we need the trade flows to keep going. So make sure we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So Igor, your question on inequality, I'm so happy you answered that. I like that question very much. And I want to separate two things on Globots, the AI and the telemigration. So the telemigration will almost surely focus, at least in its masses, on the kind of low-end skilled workers in offices. So people who are doing relatively routine things, those people will face a threat of certain things being outsourced. And that will then lead to a problem with employment. But the funny thing about it is it doesn't line up like it did in the old and the new globalization. It doesn't line up with skills anywhere near as much. Because what really is dividing line, and we talked about this before, is culture and human skills. So people who, for instance, can motivate people or run a meeting or be emphatic or ethical or innovative, those are skills that aren't the reserve solely of people who have high-end university educations. It's spread a little bit more around the economy. And since those jobs will be sheltered from telemigration, where cultural sensitivity, for example, or good language or whatever, those jobs will be sheltered. So the jobs that will be hit won't line up so well closely with skilled and unskilled as it did before. Now on automation, I think it will go the other way. So I think that we're used to thinking that globalization and automation is increasing inequality. But if you go back in history, it wasn't that way the whole time. And in particular, when the Industrial Revolution really got going around 1870, inequality fell until about 1970, and then it started rising in the rich countries. And the way I think about that is automation in the factories, it was giving more power to people who work with their hands and therefore increase their productivity and ultimately their wages. It helped people who work with their heads, the mental workers, but not nearly as much because it was indirect. It was mechanization. But after 1970, it was ICT, which gave better tools to people who work with their heads and better substitutes for people who work with their hands. So you got this skill twist that led to a rise in inequality. Because the point was, in order to make the new tools of ICT work, you needed a university degree. But the tools of AI are not like that at all. You do not need a university degree to use the AI. In fact, it's so easy to use that many of us don't even know we're using it. The Gmail introduces all sorts of AI features without even telling us. For instance, sorting out clutter and sorting out junk mail, looking through your email and putting things into your calendar. Those are AI things that are so easy to use, you do not need training. So what I think is that AI is a substitute for experience-based pattern recognition. It's substituting it with database pattern recognition. And experience-based pattern recognition is the source of many of the best, highest paid jobs in the world. So the people threatened by this are the highly paid people. And the people who are enabled by it are the average people. So if you just take, for example, a medical AI, which lets you diagnose children's diseases. For instance, there was a recent competition between real doctors and an AI that diagnosed common childhood diseases, and the AI won. Now, if you give that AI to a doctor, that doctor will be a little bit more productive. But if you give it to a nurse, it's a step change in what he or she can do. So I think AI is systematically empowering people with average intelligence and competing with people with high intelligence, so to speak. I mean, that's over exaggerating, but fundamentally it's a substitute for a type of thinking, and it's dead easy to use, so anybody can use it. I believe that there will be a set of intermediate professions that emerge between doctors and nurses, between engineers and road chiefs, between architects and draftsmen, between lawyers and paralegals. If you take the paralegal, you give them a good eye, they'll be halfway to being a lawyer, and that will make them more productive. So I think it will raise up the productivity of average people and potentially create competition for the highest level. Now, of course, the AI geniuses, they're going to be quadrillionaires, and God bless them, that's fine too. But the average people are being enabled by AI, and the smart people, like some of the present, like the university educated type people, in some sense, it's competing with them because it's pattern-based recognition. So that's my provocation is I think AI is actually going to be equalizing, and I think telemigration, it'll be more of a kaleidoscope, so it won't line up.
Thank you, Professor Baldwin, for your presentation and for answers to the questions, to the numerous questions we had. Actually, and special thanks for your optimism, because I think that you was the most optimistic participant of this conference, because at previous sessions we were quite pessimistic about the prospects of the world economy, coronavirus, trade wars, like pandemic, climate change, and so on. But now we have a lot of optimism related to technologies, first of all. Thanks for that. And again, we had an honor to have you here, and we are very happy with this. Thanks for devoting us your time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. And good luck with the rest of the conference and the dinner and everything. Sorry I couldn't be there, but
thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Уважаемые коллеги, я снова переключусь на русский. Да, профессор Болдвин был настолько оптимистичный, что верит в наш совместный ужин, хотя, к сожалению, наша конференция целиком проходит онлайн. Я хотел в завершении пригласить вас на завтрашней сессии. Завтра у нас две интереснейшие сессии. Одна будет посвящена зеленому развитию, тоже неравномерному, как и все то, что мы сегодня обсуждали. Вот завтра мы поговорим про неравномерное зеленое развитие и про то, как различные климатические клубы, возможность их формирования повлияет на борьбу с изменением климата и вообще на экономику. Вот. А после обеда мы поговорим про пути разных стран в преодолении нынешнего кризиса, о том, какие новые инструменты политики в разных областях, от монетарной до социальной, используются странами в этот кризис, кто из стран преуспел, кто наоборот, какие из этих инструментов оказались неудачными, какие наоборот оказались удачными и в дальнейшем будут использоваться все шире. Вот послеобеденная сессия будет посвящена этому. И завершится день завтра ключевым докладом Джеффри Фридена, посвященным популизму и распространению популизма и политической экономии этого процесса. Собственно, на этом я сегодня с вами прощаюсь. Надеюсь увидеть вас завтра. Спасибо всем тем, кто участвовал сегодня в нашей конференции. Мне кажется, это было очень интересно. До встречи завтра и до свидания всем.